A simple drive to buy baby supplies nearly turns into a terrifying accident. In just 1 second, CEO Quang realizes how fragile life is and how heavy the responsibility he's carrying has become. Hello, everyone. Hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we'll explore this emotional journey of Quang and Linda as they prepare for their baby. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. Morning light comes in clean through the curtains, turning the apartment bright and quiet. Linda is awake before her alarm, propped against pillows, one hand resting on her belly like she's checking in. On the nightstand sits a small notebook with a list: diapers, wipes, swaddles, 2 newborn outfits, bottles, a thermometer. Quang moves around the kitchen with careful, unnecessary purpose. He rinses a mug he already washed, lines up plates, then looks up when he hears a soft step. Linda stands in the doorway in an oversized cardigan, eyes a little tired. "You didn't sleep?" he asks. "I slept," she says. "Not well." He sets cut fruit on the table and pours warm water into her cup. "Eat a little," he says. "Then we'll go." Linda blinks. "Go where?" He nods toward the notebook. "We'll get the baby things today." Her shoulders lift, then drop. "We can do it later, when you're not busy." "I am busy," he says calmly, "and I'm still going." She picks up a piece of fruit, turns it in her fingers. "I don't want you to feel pressured." "I don't," he says, then softens. "I feel responsible." Linda looks down at the list. Buying things makes it real. Quang reaches across the table and covers her hand. "It's real," he says, "but we'll take it slow." A little later, he opens the door for her and stays close on the sidewalk, his hand hovering near her elbow without grabbing. In the car, he buckles her in carefully, then drives like he's carrying glass, slow, spacious, attentive. "I made a list," Linda says, holding up the notebook. Quang glances at it at a red light. "Good. If we forget something, we come back." "I hate coming back," she murmurs. "I know," he says, and the way he says it makes it feel like he knows more than that. She looks out the window, watching people move through their mornings like nothing can change in a second. "Do you think we're ready?" she asks. Quang keeps his eyes on the road. "We're going to be ready." "That's not the same," she says. "No," he agrees, "but it's what I can promise." They reach an intersection where the lane narrows. Quang signals and eases right. Linda glances down at her list again, and then a scooter shoots out from between 2 cars, cutting across Quang's front bumper. It's a blur of helmet and impatience. Quang brakes hard. The seatbelt snaps tight across Linda's chest. Her body jolts forward and her hands fly to her belly, instinctive and terrified. The car lurches, tires making a sharp sound on the road. The scooter wobbles, then darts away, swallowed by traffic. Quang pulls to the curb and puts the car in park. His breathing is loud in the stillness. He turns to Linda, eyes searching her face. "Are you okay?" he asks. Linda blinks, still frozen. "I think so." Her voice shakes. "The baby—" Quang takes her wrist, grounding her without crowding her. "Breathe," he says quietly. "Look at me." She does. His face is pale, jaw tight, like he just looked over an edge. "Any pain?" he asks. She shakes her head, listening. "No, just scared." Quang swallows. "I'm sorry." "It wasn't you," Linda says quickly. "He came out of nowhere." "I know," Quang says, and his voice steadies. "But I was driving." He holds her gaze. "From now on, I'll be even more careful." Linda nods, the tears pressing but not falling. "I know you will." He watches her hand on her belly. "Do you want to go home?" The easiest answer sits on her tongue. but fear feels like a door that will keep closing if she lets it. She draws a slow breath. "No," she says. "Let's still go, just slower." Quang's shoulders loosen a fraction. "Okay," he says, slower. The baby store is bright and calm, pale shelves and wide aisles, the faint smell of clean fabric. Linda steps inside and stops for a moment, her chest tightening with wonder. Everything is small, soft, meant for beginnings. Quang takes a basket and walks beside her, letting her set the pace. Linda runs her fingers over a stack of swaddles and lifts one, holding it against her forearm. "It's so small," she whispers. Quang looks at it, then at her. "Our baby is small," he says, simple as a fact. Linda lets out a soft laugh that surprises her. She moves to the clothes and picks up a tiny onesie, the sleeves no longer than her fingers. She stares at it longer than she means to. Quang doesn't rush her. He reads labels, checks sizes. When Linda stands too long in front of bottles, overwhelmed, he picks two simple ones and holds them out. "These?" he asks. Linda studies them, then nods. "Those are fine." He places them in the basket carefully. "We don't have to make everything perfect," he says. Linda's mouth tightens. "I just don't want to be a burden." Quang stops and turns to face her fully in the bright aisle. "You're not a burden," he says, slow and clear. "Not you, not the baby." She looks away, blinking fast. "You already have so much," she whispers. "I have a lot," he agrees. "And I want this too." At checkout, the basket is fuller than Linda expected, but not excessive. Diapers, wipes, two soft outfits, a light blanket, the thermometer, tiny socks that make her smile because they look almost unreal. Quang pays without lingering on the total. Outside, the sun is still bright. Quang carries the bags even when Linda reaches for one. "I've got it," he says. In the car, Linda rests her hand on her belly again, breathing slower now. Quang starts the engine, then pauses and turns to her. "Thank you for coming," he says. Linda looks at him, eyes soft. "Thank you for not letting me hide." Quang nods once. He drives smoothly, steady and careful, and Linda watches the bags at her feet as if they're proof of something good. When they get home, Quang sets everything on the table and steps aside. Linda begins to unpack, folding the tiny clothes with careful hands, smoothing the fabric as if she's smoothing her own fear. Quang stays close, quiet, and ready. Linda holds up the smallest onesie and smiles, and for a moment the apartment feels warm in the simplest way, like a home learning how to make room. Linda lines the tiny clothes along the edge of the bed, grouping them by size the way she used to organize work files. Her movements are careful, almost ceremonial. Quang stands nearby, leaning against the door frame, watching without interrupting. The afternoon light slides across the floor, catching on the pale fabric and making everything look softer than it felt earlier. "These socks," Linda says, holding up a pair no bigger than her thumb. "How does something this small even stay on?" Quang smiles. "Maybe it doesn't. Maybe that's the point." She laughs quietly and places them in the drawer. When she straightens, her breath catches for a second, subtle enough that she thinks he won't notice. He does. "Sit," he says gently, pulling out the chair by the desk. "I'm fine." "I know," he says. "Sit anyway." She does. He brings her a glass of water and waits until she takes a sip before returning to the bed. He folds the blanket once, twice, then stops, realizing he doesn't know where it should go. "Top shelf?" he asks. Linda nods. "For now." They work like that for a while, passing things back and forth, exchanging small questions that don't need full answers. The apartment fills with the quiet sounds of settling, drawers closing, hangers sliding, the soft rustle of cotton. At some point, Linda goes still. Her hand presses lightly to her belly, her eyes distant. Quang notices immediately. "What is it?" She hesitates, listening inward. Then her face softens. "I felt something, not a kick, just movement." He freezes, afraid to breathe. "Now," she nods. "Just now." He steps closer, unsure what to do with his hands. "Can I?" She guides his palm to the spot, warm through the fabric of her dress. They wait together. Nothing happens. Linda smiles anyway. Maybe later. Quang keeps his hand there a moment longer than necessary, as if memorizing the feeling. "Okay," he says quietly. Evening comes slowly. Quang makes dinner with what's left in the fridge. Nothing fancy. Linda sits at the table, watching him move with practiced efficiency. He pauses once, noticing the faint mark from the seatbelt on her shoulder, already fading. "Does it still hurt?" he asks. She shakes her head. "No, it's gone." He nods, then reaches for the pan again. "If you ever want to stop halfway through something," he says, not looking at her, "we stop." "I know. And if you change your mind later, I know," she repeats more firmly this time. They eat together in comfortable silence. Linda finishes first and leans back, one hand circling her belly absent-mindedly. Quang clears the dishes and joins her, resting his elbows on the table. "I was thinking," Linda says, "about earlier." Quang looks up. "About the car?" "Yes." She takes a breath. "When it happened, I didn't think about myself. I thought about everything else." He nods once. "Me too." "It scared me," she admits. "How fast things can change." Quang reaches across the table, linking their fingers. "That's why I want us to take things one step at a time." Linda studies his hand, strong and steady. "You don't ever get scared?" He considers the question. "I do," he says. "I just don't always say it out loud." She squeezes his hand. "You can, with me." Later they sit on the couch with the lights dimmed. Quang scrolls through his phone, then sets it down face first on the table. "What?" Linda asks. "Work can wait," he says. "Tonight it can." She shifts closer, resting her head against his shoulder. "You don't have to do everything." "I know," he says, "but I want to do some things." She smiles at that, eyes closing for a moment. The room feels settled, like it's holding them carefully. When Linda stands to get ready for bed, Quang follows her into the bedroom. She moves slower now, mindful of her balance. He watches, ready to step in if needed, but she manages fine. She changes into a soft nightgown and sits on the edge of the bed. Quang kneels to help her with her slippers, something she didn't ask for but doesn't refuse. "Quang," she says quietly. He looks up. "Yes?" "If today had gone differently..." She trails off, then shakes her head. "Never mind." He stands and sits beside her, turning to face her fully. "Say it." She meets his eyes. "Would you have regretted it? All of this?" He doesn't answer immediately. He reaches for her hands instead, grounding himself in the warmth of her skin. "I would have regretted not being here," he says, "not choosing this." Her eyes fill, but she doesn't cry. She leans forward and rests her forehead against his. "Promise me something," she whispers. "Anything I can promise, honestly." "Promise you'll tell me when you're afraid." He exhales, slow and steady. "I promise." They lie down together, the space between them small but intentional. Linda turns onto her side, facing him. Quang adjusts the blanket, tucking it around her without trapping her. "Do you think we'll be good at this?" she asks softly. He smiles, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I think we'll learn." Her breathing evens out gradually. Quang stays awake a little longer, listening to the quiet rhythms of the apartment, the distant city settling for the night. He places his hand gently on her belly, not expecting anything, just being present. After a while, Linda stirs and murmurs his name. "I'm here," he whispers. She doesn't answer, already drifting back into sleep. Quang remains still, letting the moment pass naturally. Outside, the streetlights glow steady and unremarkable. Inside, the room holds its peace, and for now, that feels like enough.
Trong tập này, Linda và bà Linda theo bà và cậu cháu ra nương mía. Dưới nắng sớm, bà vừa chặt mía vừa kể chuyện ngày xưa. Dậy chặt 3 hoặc 4 khúc cho đẹp để bán được giá. Đồng mía cao dần, 45 đồng trở thành hy vọng cho phiên chợ. Một cây mía đổ bất ngờ khiến cả nhóm kêu, rồi cười xòa vì kịp đỡ nhau. Chiều xuống, Linda buồn bã vì con rúi của mình đã biến mất. Nghi có kẻ trộm rình quanh nhà. CEO Quang ghé đến lắng nghe và trấn an và tự sửa chiếc camera cũ trong kho, kéo dây lắp trước sân nhà để bảo vệ cô. Đêm đến, Linda nấu cơm nếp cẩm mời anh ở lại ăn. Hai người trò chuyện lòng ấm lại. Quang kể áp lực công ty, camera nháy sáng, bóng lạ thoáng qua, và không biết Linda có sống sót qua được đêm nay không. Mọi người nếu thấy video hay, hãy cho mình một like, một subscribe. Cảm ơn mọi người nhé.